and welcome to the Future of Employee Experience. Very excited to have you with me today. Thank you so much for giving us the time.
Hello, Sally. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Me too. And I'm really excited to get to know you a little bit better, and I know that our listeners and watchers will be too. So give me a little bit about Lettie. Where do you come from? What was your path and your journey that led you to employee experience?
Yeah, so I was born and bred in the streets of Soweto, the dusty but very vibrant streets of Soweto. So I am a township product through and through. I come from a very big family of six. There were six of us at home. There's five of us, unfortunately, now. I was raised really by very strong women. Both my mother and my grandmother were professionals. They were both nurses, and they were married to men. My grandfather was a laborer, and my dad was an administration clerk, but their union really worked. So I was surrounded by a balance of you are able to be a strong woman and be supported and celebrated by your partner. So this is what, I grew around as firstborn at home. So I was encouraged to sort of set the example. So it had its privileges, but it also had its moments of being pressurized. Sure. So, I followed your traditional sort of, you go to school, you go to varsity. When I went to varsity, I wanted to become a lawyer because my teachers at high school, I was in the debating society. I couldn't play any sports to save my life. I started wearing glasses when I was 14. So you can imagine, I've always been one of the nerd groups. I had a passion for history and politics and the like. So, I studied history in school and biology. And partly because, when I went to school, it was still, Bantu education. So if you didn't get the maths concept, they would beat it into you. So I just decided, no, maths was not my thing. But I'm glad I changed my mindset around it over time. So when I went to varsity, by virtue of the fact that I'd been in the debating society and the like, my teachers said, you would make a good lawyer. So I went into varsity, which was then RA when I went to varsity to study law. And I discovered I didn't like it. And there was the dean of students at the time, a very kind Afrikaans gentleman, sat me down and asked me what were my interests. And he sort of said, the trajectory for me to start exploring different and new things. Yeah. And I ended up studying politics, philosophy, English literature, history, and ended up in human resources, which was, so I sort of, that was my trajectory. And then I found myself in human resources by default. And then, found an interest and a passion in it. And that's how I sort of landed in where I am now.
Okay, and when we start to talk about that, that's a hugely interesting. You sound like a lifelong learner, that you've covered so many different topics. And do you think going through philosophy and that sort of thing has helped you in terms of really starting to understand the human condition and how that relates to employee experience and where we are now?
I think so. I think, having a broad scope of learning exposes you to certain things that you otherwise would not have been exposed to. That's the first thing. The second thing is I find that you tend to make reference to your previous learnings as you go along in your journey. So I sort of now have this arsenal that I can keep on adding tools into, but drawing, one of my arrows in there or my quivers or whatever the case may be that I need. And not just from a formal learning point of view, by the way, Sally, from an informal learning point of view as well. So the exposure and the network that I've created over the years, I find that it is continuously shaping and molding and adding, to making me a credible and a trusted advisor around the employee experience space. I really owe it, probably mostly, Sally, to the informal learning that I've been exposed to, people being very generous to share with me and teach me. And either sharing a bit of themselves or their stories, but the experiences as well. I found that I think when I reflect and ruminate over it, probably my best learning has been around the informal space with people really telling me their stories and sharing with me.
Yeah, I think that story sharing is really well, in my opinion, the only way we're truly able to understand, the lived experience and reality of another person. And that's why I think in the employee experience world, it's so important to look at the community aspect of the employee experience. I always think that that's a very sometimes
Underattached.
Yeah, it's just really not something that everybody focuses on it. But I think if we look now, and I'm going to touch a little bit on trends now, but I think this has been the big focus around everyone talking about the hybrid versus office-based work and things. That's really been around the community focus of employee experience. So moving on to that, I mean, what are the big trends to watch? I mean, as we round out 2022 and we start to look at 2023, what are the big trends in employee experience that you see on the horizon?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the biggest trends, obviously there's quite a lot. I mean, probably about 11 that we can talk about, but I'll focus on maybe about 3 of them. The first one is obviously the hybrid way of work, and it's shifting. It's not what it was 2 years ago. It's not what it was at the beginning of this year, just as an example. And it's one of those trends that are shaping the working environment so quickly that we constantly have to keep up. As soon as you think you've got the best of that trend, or you understand where it's going, it changes a little bit, right? And within the hybrid space, I mean, if you just look at just the remote working, there's subsets there, right? There's people, if we look at the South African context and globally, there's employees who've gone and emigrated. That's one subset of it that you need to deal with, especially if you're not a global company. How do you cater for that? And then there's employees who've semigrated, that is, have relocated from their original place of work and have gone and found themselves a space and taking advantage of the technology to be able to connect. So that's the one big trend that's continuously shaping how we work. The other trend is around employees waking up or being vocal about needing flexibility around how to structure their benefits. Because I think the pandemic, that's another gift that it's given us to really reflect at a human level, to reflect about yourself as an employee and what works and what doesn't work for you. And those days of where employees are content to say, oh, I've got medical aid and I can work it within these plans, and I've got a pension fund and whatnot, or a provident fund, those days are slowly coming to an end. Employees want flexibility to say, what if I don't need medical aid for this point in time? What if I don't want a pension fund? What if I want to make my own decisions around that? And it circles around, the voice of the employee, Overlaying that, Sally, is the fact that with employees being more vocal or being more woke around who they are as human beings, and the fact that we are not robots when we go to work, is the role of the manager, right? What does it mean to manage an employee now? That's another trend. So there's 2 elements for me there that are key. We can either see it as a threat to say, does it mean we need to get rid of managers and have just a few? There's a study that says that by 2025, Sally, probably around 65% of what we consider today as managerial duties will be automated. What does that mean for the role of the manager? So we're either getting rid of managers, or we rebrand or reimagine the role of a manager. And the manager does not become the traditional, you come in, you manage, you make sure that people go and leave, or whatever the case may be. Maybe the call has been for manager as coach, actually doing what you're supposed to do as a manager. So those, for me, are the 3 key trends that I think are quite important, that we'll see them becoming more and more prominent. And perhaps maybe we can sneak in a 4th one. And I'm saying this in no particular order. A 4th one is a key focus now. The call is growing louder and louder for companies to show tangible action and effort as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that has many subsets. That has many multiple subsets. One of the subsets of that is around how do how does corporate South Africa respond to gender-based violence or intimate partner violence? Because diversity, equity, and inclusion means employees must feel safe in the environment that they work in.
Yeah.
How do we as corporate South Africa respond to that? And that's just a big, the DEI has multiple subsets. So those are the 4 key ones that I'd like to outline today.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions on that, because I think what you've uncovered, there's a huge amount of really interesting content. So going back to the first one, when you were talking about the benefit stacks and looking at that, how do you see that rolling out? Do you think that's going to be more a kind of a self-service, let me choose where I am in my own life stage, and I can start to add and subtract benefits like in a kind of basket? I mean, how do you see that working?
So, I mean, I think the ideal would be that employees would be able to choose and have flexibility in terms of, do they want benefits or not? Companies, when they offer benefits, they're coming from the stance of being a responsible employer,
Yes,
right? To say we must make sure that you are covered and whatnot. But we find that employees all have different needs at different times. And if we are to change something like this, we need infrastructure around it.
Yes.
And I think most companies don't have that infrastructure to cater for right now, as most companies are catering for permanent employees, and you've got these benefits. And the most flexibility you get out of that is if you're not on the company's medical aid that is being offered as the medical aid of choice, you need to prove that you're on somebody else's medical aid, your spouse. That's the most flexibility you're going to get.
Or you get a choice between pension and provident, I mean, that's another choice.
Yes, that's another choice, yes, pension and provident. But if we are now going to change that as companies, we need to take a step back and say, what kind of infrastructure, technology, and otherwise do we need to support that? What needs to be unlearned by the company and the employees? And what do we need to relearn around benefits and the structuring of benefits? Because we've gone and we've structured it in such a way that, we're looking out for employees. So the ideal, I think, in terms of the growing call and the voice to say we want, and what permanent employees are now seeing from contract employees, because remember, contract employees, they get their salary and they can decide what they want to do with it. So it's sort of, the wind is blowing in that direction. But employees still do want a safety net of sorts. And it also depends on the generation that you're speaking about and where employees are. So it would need a grand study of the type of employee you have in the company and what their needs are at a specific point in time. And as those needs change, how do you then cater for their needs? How do you track their life cycle? Now there's graduates, now they're done, now they're married, now they're divorced, and all of that, to sort of offer a bouquet that would work for employees for that. So it's going to be an interesting thing, but it's going to be a grand study. And I can guarantee you that we'll probably get it wrong a few times, but we sort of need to take our employees on the journey, because they will give input and we need to co-craft with them. They will give input in terms of what that will look like.
Yeah, I think there's also a huge shift in responsibility there around the education, around benefits, of really understanding what a pension and provident in that fund is. I think it places a lot more time and resource from a company's perspective into the top line of pre-interview material, pre-onboarding. Like, that space becomes then a lot richer in terms of what the employee decision-making cycles are. And I think it's going to be somewhat controversial. I think it's going to, it's going to put a lot of more emphasis, to me, on the financial services providers and the group benefit offerings from companies, to say what flexibility is there, what onus on education is coming from the provider in that space, and what other benefit stacks are going to come out that speak to the values that employees are looking at in companies. I was having a chat with a client yesterday, and with a service provider that's looking to offer benefits around impact farming, that from an alternative stream of income as a benefit stack. And it was such an interesting conversation, because that's so aligned with where the employer is, and the sort of community focus that they have. So it's very interesting to see how companies are now casting around to see what benefits also align with the values that we say that we have. And as a purpose-led organization, they're starting to cast the net a little wider, which I think is interesting.
Yes, absolutely. 100%.
And then you were talking about the role of manager. So I was reading an article yesterday again about the self-managed workforce coming into play. And I mean, do you think that there's a chance of that happening, or do you think it is about more the repositioning of, as you say, more around somebody stepping into the role as a coach that works with a specific team? How do you see that playing out?
I think there's space for both. I think, in fact, there's space for multiple phases, as it were, because the change that's happening is also happening in phases. So I still think, there's still a greater emphasis on holding that one particular person accountable for team goals and things like that. But I think that shift is happening. And if we overlay that with the agile way of working, that speaks more to more self-managed teams and things like that, you still find, though, that there is a component there where someone or something is being held accountable for the final outcome, as it were. So I think there is definitely space for both. I don't think it's going to be a full swing of the pendulum to the one extreme. One, I think, is going to be gradual. But I think there is still room, to have your self-managed or self-managed organizations, self-managed teams that produce, but definitely the role of manager as it currently stands is going to change quite drastically.
What do you think? Yeah, sorry.
Even in those self-managed environments or teams, the role sort of change. There's no hierarchy there or anything like that. There's no form of hierarchy. You've got people around the table who are empowered to make decisions, and they each bring something to the table, and they then collaborate. So you're probably looking at somebody who's going to facilitate the collaboration more than manage the collaboration. So someone who's going to make sure that everyone is working in collaboration. A facilitator probably is where the role is going.
That's so interesting. And my question was going to be, so do you think then that there's also, I mean, I always find this very interesting in my own business, because we're a very flat structure and very non-traditional in a lot of senses. But the question still comes from my employees around, so how do I see that I'm progressing, because we don't really have titles and we don't have managers? So what do you think has to happen in that space? Do you think there's kind of a dual education role where people have to understand that sort of autonomy and mastery is the new manager? Or how do you, I don't know how we would educate both sides, because people also want to know that they're progressing, and they were brought up where you were promoted if you were good. Which is actually doesn't really work at all. Everybody now knows that the head developer should not be the CTO. It's a different skill set,
Absolutely. So a lot of unlearning needs to happen. And I think some of that unlearning in organizations has begun to happen. If I were to give you an example, here at Momentum Metropolitan, we now have a career path of a leader as a specialist. Okay. So the traditional role of managing a team is no longer the only way to progress. So you can be a specialist and you can still be recognized, be developed, and grow in the career ladder, just as an example, grow up the career ladder. But if we look at more, how this is now evolving, these specialists around the table, we need to unlearn first what progress looks like. We need to redefine that progress now means that you are amassing skills And it's not, your progress is not linked to growth in a role, but lateral growth in terms of gaining more skills and being involved in different projects where you continuously honing new skills or applying skills that you have learned. So growth is more that way rather than vertical. And we need to overlay that with a recognition and a reward system that will talk to it. Because the biggest thing around growth, and that is why you find that we will promote people into role as managers, and they're specialists, they're good at what they do, but they really don't want to manage teams. And that's perfectly okay. But they must, and they're chasing after the management of teams because it comes with the status, but it also comes with the recognition. Right? So we need to then review and relook our recognitions and our reward, the entire thing, because then you won't have the question of, so how will I know I'm progressing? Because it will be very clear what progress looks like and how we're going to recognize you within this very flat, structured environment, and what your growth looks like. That your growth is not that way, that you have people. It's more about involvement in more projects. It's more about being called upon to bring in your expertise. It's more about, I need to learn a new skill because I need to rebrand because there's this project playing out somewhere else.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's a lot that's going to happen in that space. That sort of, if you can remunerate your kind of impact players correctly, I think that you'll start seeing that, and then that's where you start to truly get those cross-functional teams and that skill set passing along, because then people don't want to stay in their lane because that's the only way they'll progress. They're happy to then share that skill across teams. I think that's we start to see some cool innovation there.
Yes.
So looking now at the non-negotiables that employee experience leaders should focus on, I think, and I don't want to direct the conversation too much, but I wonder if you could touch on a little bit more around the DEI and the gender-based violence, sexual harassment, because I think this is a non-negotiable that has to start coming out in this space, and I know you're passionate about it. So what is your opinion around that and other non-negotiables that you think EX leaders need to look at?
Yeah, so we've now gone and made into law an act within the employment equity space around harassment in the workplace, right? Yeah. And I think promulgating laws and prescripts, that's the easy part. It's essentially, how do you put those in place? Because if we look at South Africa as a whole, if you look at all of our acts and our laws, especially post-1994, very good legislation there.
Progressive,
very good pieces of legislation. My goodness, quite impressive. It's all in the application where things fall short. So if we look at gender-based violence within the scope of DE&I, a multi-sectoral approach is important. We cannot just look at it as a one-dimensional. It's fluid, it's forever moving, and we need the participants of multiple key stakeholders to make it happen. Yeah. So if we look at gender-based violence just as a focus area for corporate South Africa and other institutions, it needs to be included in the culture and how we do things around here. If I look at our business, when we talk about gender-based violence, we're saying we want to ensure that we approach a zero tolerance stance and nobody feels unsafe. But we shouldn't forget that in that environment, you've also got perpetrators there. So you cannot just focus on the survivors. You need to focus on, what do you do with the perpetrators? How do you rehabilitate the perpetrators of gender-based violence? But you also need then to do an analysis and pinpoint the risks. How do you pinpoint who the perpetrators are? How do you even go about doing that? So there's an analysis that needs to happen and a risk assessment that needs to take place to point you in the right direction. What we've been doing for the most part in corporate South Africa is to support the survivors of gender-based violence. Obviously, it's the right thing to do. But I think where our efforts fall short is that we support them in the working environment and we send them back to the toxic broader environment. Somebody who is experiencing gender-based violence at home comes to work, they're safe, But before they can get out of that environment, they go back to that same toxic environment.
Yeah.
When they manage to get out, protection orders don't work and whatnot. So we need, the policing system. We need an efficient policing system to overlay all of this, to aid corporate South Africa. We need a justice system that will work very fast in order to make sure that these cases are brought to book. So even when a survivor manages to leave a toxic environment, we've known of cases where they are stopped and they are harassed by the perpetrator because the law is just not efficient enough for them to book. So we need that multi-sectoral approach. But it doesn't mean we must sit and wait for all the other pieces to work.
Yeah.
From a company point of view, saying we take a zero tolerance stance is one thing, but actually making sure that we're taking a zero tolerance stance is another. And that's where also the application comes in. We've now got an updated act around harassment, which means as employers, we've got the obligation when we are told to investigate as soon as possible. We've got the obligation to look into these things as soon as possible. As custodians of the policy in, the human capital or employee experience space, we've got the obligation to know that we are not to appease those who come and say, I'm feeling unsafe. We've also got then the obligation to drive a continuous education and awareness campaign around what does this mean for me as an employee. So, and this campaign must also always be driving the fact that it is safe for you in this environment.
Yeah.
It must overlay all of that. It must overlay all the efforts to say, above all else, this is a safe space for you. This is a space where you belong and you are included in that particular space.
And I mean, what is your viewpoint then on how transparent organizations should be in terms of dealing with accusations? Because I mean, when we look at the safety aspect of it, most people that are victims are mostly afraid to speak up because they fear the persecution, obviously. And I mean, there's a lot of gender bias and things that we can, we obviously all know about, but I mean, I think a lack of transparency and a lack of trust that something will happen is often the reason why people don't speak up. So what do you think? I mean, that's very difficult then to put out and to say this person, potentially a person in power, is a perpetrator and has been taken to task and has been prosecuted or removed from the company. How open do you think companies are going to have to be about that? I mean, it's quite a difficult subject.
It is very difficult. It's a very difficult one because we are also operating from a stance of innocent until proven guilty and whatnot, right? I think if we're staying within the ambit of the law, we can manage the transparency. However, we do also, like you said, we want to build trust in the system. We want our employees to trust that the process and the system we've put in place, especially to report and to ventilate, they're systems that they can trust, they can use, and they won't be victimized. That's the one part. But the system must also cater for the fact that sometimes there are false accusations.
Of course.
How do you then deal with it? So that transparency bit must also be operated within the ambit of, without making the one who is reporting to feel like they shouldn't be reporting, but also following the innocent until proven guilty. You need to strike some sort of balance there, but put it out there that we will investigate because we have a zero tolerance stance. And if there are false accusations, the consequences, there has to be consequences.
Yes, agreed.
Because you also want to display the fact that we will also not, because that is a form of harassment if you falsely accuse someone. That is harassment. So there has to be consequences either way. Now, in terms of do we need to be outright transparent, it is a tricky one.
Yeah.
It is a tricky one. And I think it is probably a journey because it also relies on the environment within which we're operating in as South Africa.
Yeah.
The broader environment. Like I said, the other key stakeholders need to be working efficiently for everything else, to work, because you go maybe and you be transparent about the internal process that you have followed, and the external process exonerates that person.
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So I know I haven't given you an answer, but I'm just
I don't think there is one.
The complexities. Yeah.
I don't think there is one. And I mean, I think, even if we look at what's happening in that to train our leaders or our coaches or whatever, to also the sensitivity, the bias training around that, the skill set to assist somebody that is in a toxic environment and doesn't know how to leave, to be able to empower them. That is, now we're moving into a real sort of psychological counseling space, which is really not what necessarily everybody signed up for. So it's very nuanced and very difficult. And so off the back of that, I mean, what do you think around like how EAP systems and those sort of things at the moment are going to have to alter or change or shift to be able to support some more of these nuances?
Yeah. So maybe before I touch on those nuances, just at the back of the comment that you made around training, managers and the like, it's one of those skill sets that we need to now hone in as organizations to say, managers, people, leaders, human capital, that skill set around compassion and empathy is something that needs to be trained, because now part of the role of a manager is to create a sense of psychological safety.
Yes.
They are not therapists, yes, but they need to create psychological safety. And we need to be able to train them to say, here's a toolkit, here's how you handle the situation, here's where you hand over, and here's how you hand over, right? But you are training people who come, like you said, with their own biases, their own unconscious bias. So you need to deal with that unconscious bias first before you take them through a toolkit. You can't just give them a toolkit, because you could be giving a toolkit to somebody who's a perpetrator, or somebody who's been a survivor of gender-based violence, but has not dealt with it properly. So there are conversations and ventilations that need to happen prior to you saying, okay, now here you go, here's the toolkit. And I know that most organizations, we do the toolkit, we do the roadshows, the trainings and whatnot, but we are probably landing all of this on very wounded people, very broken people. Right. So something to think about. Now, EAP has always been used as an organization, as a crutch. Because prior to probably the pandemic, and maybe not just the pandemic, maybe let's say 10 years up to now, well-being, employee wellness was never on the strategic agenda of a business, on the business strategic agenda. It's been a human capital agenda, but even in human capital, just an appendage. Right? The pandemic has pronounced the importance of employee well-being, and it's put it right at the center of the business agenda. So the partnership with EAP providers needs to be different. I mean, companies would use EAP, to say, come, give us a report every quarter, who's using you, who's not. Now we need to have more deeper conversations with EAP providers to say, right, employee well-being is a strategic imperative for us. How do we structure the benefits of employee well-being in such a way that it pronounces and it elevates the agenda of employee well-being? What does employee well-being mean? What areas should we be focusing on? What are our employees saying? How do we analyze the information that we get from the reports that you give us? And what do we then focus on based on the reports that you give us on a monthly or quarterly basis? So the relationship needs to change. And I think with most companies, it's now beginning to change. We no longer outsource employee well-being. It's now very much insourced. And we're saying to our EAP providers, please, we need to walk the journey together. We actually need to use each other as thinking partners. What do you think? What are you seeing? What should we be doing better? Instead of saying, deal with it, call ICAS or call the other EAP, whichever EAP, call them and they will sort you out. Now it's a matter of come in, let's sit around the table. What does this mean for us? So the relationship has definitely changed.
I mean, no longer can mental health only help be provided only when there's a traumatic event? People now just what they need, they want to talk to somebody, and that is now something that they're saying, this should be part of my benefit. I should be able to speak to someone without it specifically being linked to like what is identified previously as trauma.
Yes. I must refer myself. I mustn't wait.
Yes. Yeah. Because now if it's showing up really badly. So
exactly.
Yeah.
It's late by then. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, off the back of that, I mean, we've spoken a bit about some of the challenges in the space. What do you think are the new skills and what do you think the future employee experience leaders need to master now to be able to kind of take all of this on?
Yeah, so I think most definitely empathy and compassion, like I said, before as we're having the conversation, empathy and compassion. But there's also an element, and I'm not sure if this is a skill as such, an element of how do we leverage technology to partner with us on this journey? How do we leverage technology here, to partner with us, to assist us on this journey? Because there's a lot that technology can do that we might not be able to do to complement the employee experience agenda. The other skill is around data analysis, or data analytics as a whole is key. In the world of employee experience, you as the employee experience guru need to be guiding the company relying on data. You need to be able to mine that data, analyze that data, and analyze it against real life trends at all times. Then you need to sort of proactively approach your constituents to say, we probably need to be going in that direction. But you need to do this in the ambit of empathy and compassion, and not, like you structuring things to deal with robots. So for me, it is empathy, compassion, and data analytics. Data is key. Data is going to be the next sought after resource next to gold and water and whatnot. And the ability to maintain accurate data, the ability to mine data and find different ways of mining data is going to be key. I think employers that are going to win the war for talent are employers that are going to be able to find data proactively and find new sources of data proactively and mine that data and use it proactively.
Oh, fully agreed. I mean, if I look at everything that we've sort of said today and to sort of look at it in the world of where I think employee experience is going, data comes from multiple sources within a business that speaks to different areas of employee experience and has to be consolidated. Once you've got that consolidated set of data, then to be able to apply machine learning to predict what the employee will need next and serve them that unique offering, very kind of Netflix style, or that is what the employee wants. That is the employee experience. It is for you to know what I'm going to need and assist me on that next step through a combination of what's coming out of EAP, what's happening in retention, health, medical aid. But it's to get all of those data sources into one repository and allow that to then really be taken on to the next level. Because for me, that predictive analytics of you knowing what I'm going to need, in the way that Facebook knows what I, started giving me baby formula like almost before I knew I was pregnant. That's kind of what the employee is expecting, and even if they can't articulate that at this point in time, I think that's what they want,
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want you to know me the way that Google knows me.
Exactly. If not even more.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, going back to a bit of DI, it's something that I'm super passionate about, and I know you are as well. How do you suggest that employee experience leaders start to incorporate diversity and inclusion focus into their employee experience strategy?
Sure. So I think first and foremost, D&I has to be clearly articulated in the business strategy. Just let's start there.
Yes, absolutely.
And in it being articulated there, it must be driven from the top as almost our license to trade as an organization.
Love
You know,
that.
it's our license to trade. If we are not a diverse and an inclusive environment, we've got no right whatsoever to trade in the country and in the country and in the global village, given this time where we're in.
Yeah.
So I find that D&I initiatives fall short because they're not driven from the top. Like I said, it's one thing to have it as policies and whatnot. The D&I initiatives that we have, they're great. But if they're not driven from the top, if the topmost male or female in the business is not speaking the language and not walking the talk, then it's very difficult to incorporate it bottom up.
Yeah.
The other thing around that D&I, you're building an inclusive environment for people. They need to tell you what inclusivity feels like for them. You need to ask your employees, so what does inclusivity mean for you? What does it mean for you? And you need to take that information and build your D&I strategy around what your employee is telling you. So it can be a daunting exercise, but a very exciting exercise.
Yeah.
Because then it colors that canvas so brightly. Professor Bonang Mohali says diversity is you being invited to the party and probably being asked to dance. That's diversity.
Yeah.
Inclusivity is when they play your song.
Yeah.
Then you know that you are, included. So by playing your song, somebody had to ask you, what's your favorite music?
Yes, exactly.
Somebody had to ask you. So, they probably invited you to the party because they felt sorry for you. And, no, maybe they're trying to, let's bring you in.
Yeah.
But when somebody says, so what music do you listen to? Then you are including me. Then you are taking into account because then you're listening to my voice.
Yeah.
I like this type of music. And then not only do you listen, you do something about it.
You play the song.
And you play my song. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Right? So the voice of the employee is very important in a D&I strategy. So from the top, then the employees must tell you what they want. We've got an initiative that we're doing at Momentum Metropolitan, and it started off with the need to tell our transformation story. What is our story? Because we found that we've had milestones. We've had the good, the bad, and the ugly, but we don't know what our story is. So we started a journey working with the transformation team, working with our storytellers to say, what is our transformation story? And we agreed we're going to tell the good, the bad, the ugly of a transformation story because that is our story and we're going to own our story.
Yeah.
And then overlaying all of that, Sally, was we would like our employees to tell us their experience of transformation in the business.
Yeah, great.
How have they experienced transformation?
Yeah.
And we're working on that, and I cannot wait for it to launch because it's the voice of the employee saying it's either working or it's not working for me, and this is why it's not working, and this is what you can do about it to make it work. And we are inviting our employees to say, so D&I, voice of the employee, they must tell you.
Have you ever found a South African that doesn't like to give you their opinion? I mean,
never.
It's something that binds us all together. We all like to give an opinion and just ask. They'll tell you,
Yes, just ask. Just ask. That's exactly it.
We're busy with one of our clients. We're rolling out the big D&I initiative to 42,000 of their employees. And hosting conversations all across the country. We've done about 700 at this point. And, the big thing that keeps coming out is just everybody is so happy and open to have a platform to speak and to share their stories. Everybody wants to, and everybody else wants to listen to it. Everyone is so interested in what is your unique lived experience. I really want to know because I work with you, because generally speaking, most people aren't bad. They really don't know that they're being awful and they want to do better. They just don't know how. you know.
Yes,
So
yes.
when we start sharing our stories in that way, everybody knows how to be a little bit better and a little more open to it, you know.
Magic happens when we start sharing our stories. Magic happens
Yeah.
because that whole unconscious bias conversation comes to the fore.
Mm.
When you know where I'm coming from and I know where you're coming from, then we can sit and think, oh, goodness, okay, I never really thought of it like that. Now I know your story, I understand you a bit better. And it binds us because now I know a little bit about you that I didn't know previously. You know, that dispels whatever assumptions I had. So yeah, we need to listen. We need to provide the platform.
And I always wonder, why are we not using our employee base when we look at things like marketing, when we look at things that are going out to our customer, when we look at how our website lands? Why are we not running that through our employees or subsets of our employees or our ERGs and saying, what do you pick up here that perhaps is offensive or othering in any kind of way?
Yes.
What is your opinion about this? Vote on what you like the most or what you think we should change, because that is the only way that we can pick up what might be losing us talent on our website or going to offend a potential, you know, high impact customer, is by getting that diversity of thought and voice.
100%, 100%. And we've got a richness of diversity. If we look at any employee base, it's rich with diversity.
And they
Rich with
should be
opinions.
reflecting our customer.
Absolutely. Yes, yes,
you know?
yes. Yeah, 1,000%.
So what is the one thing, if I have to ask to sum up, what is the one thing that you would ask our listeners to take away from this interview and implement today in their employee experience leadership style?
So if I can give you two, the first one is back to voice of the employee. If you want to improve, if you want to craft, if you want to maintain an employee experience that is relevant, that is fit for purpose, you need to ask. The voice of the employee is critical. The second thing is we're now operating in this hybrid working way of work. We are probably never going to go back to work how things were. We now need to discuss with our employees, how do we maintain that culture of stickiness remotely?
Yeah.
How do we still maintain the culture of stickiness, connectedness, and collaboration where we are working remotely? Because we can't have the water cooler chats or whatever the case may be. How do we use technology to help us to maintain that stickiness?
Yeah, very interesting that the culture chat. I read a thing again on LinkedIn this morning that said, you know, back-to-back meetings is a culture. Asking to have meetings over lunch is culture.
Yes.
You know, all of these things are culture. And how do we set the culture protocols for those things now? And how do, but again, your point is so well made. Just ask, you know.
Absolutely.
So Lettie, tell me, how can our listeners connect with you? Where do you do more thought leadership? What is your preferred platform that people can follow you on?
So on LinkedIn, I'm very much quite active on LinkedIn, so they can follow me on LinkedIn, but also I can share with you my email address. I converse a lot with people on email address. Once we're on email, if we take it further, then, you know, I can share WhatsApp. I'm also very good on WhatsApp. So around thought leadership, mostly on LinkedIn and also on email.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing so much of what you're doing and your thoughts around this. It's been a really interesting conversation for me. I really appreciate the time, and thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Some very thought-provoking questions. Thank you so much. Thank you for the dialogue. I also really enjoyed it.
Good.
And thank you for your time and for having me.
Thank you.